hit the right button. Love that sound. Recording in progress, that voice. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to Continuing Professional Education Services, our chat for the month of July. It is July 8th, believe it or not. Tough to imagine. I am Phil Brilliant. I am from Continuing Professional Education Services, along with my partner, Jorge Berkowitz, who will be moderating and doing a one-on-one this morning with our guest speaker. And also with us is Julianne Masago, I always say our Director of Operations. And the reason that we are all here today, because without her assistance and without her making sure that we all get notices of what room to get into, we would be going around the World Wide Web and looking for the right Zoom room, which hopefully someday very soon we will stop doing, or we will not do as much, though I don't think we'll ever stop doing this. It is the new world that we are living in. I will throw a quick plug out, though, that on August 10th, CIANJ as well as CPES are doing a joint program at Montclair State University in person with Barry Frasco from DEP on the site remediation, the remediation standards that came out in May. It'll be a panel discussion as well as a Q&A, as well as a presentation by Barry. So I throw that out there this morning just so everybody can hear that. But this program is not about me talking. This is about Dr. Jorge Berkowitz, and I don't think he really requires a lot of introduction. If he does, he will spend 20 minutes doing it. And our guest for today is Irene Kropp, the former Deputy Commissioner of DEP, the former Assistant Commissioner of Site Remediation. And I think George will do more of an introduction because Irene, we have called you the architect of SRRA for this presentation today, though there are people who do call you the mother of SRRA, so the Site Remediation Reform Act. And we do thank you for joining us this morning. And George, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank all of our attendees. These things these 1 hour chats tend to be really a lot of fun in many cases and very informative in most cases and practically all cases. I'm not going to give Irene a huge introduction simply because as a result of the questions that I've given her, her background will emerge on its own. I will say the following, that stuff that's not going to be addressed. I've had the pleasure of working with Irene. Back in 1980, I first met Irene when I went down from Rutgers to DEP on a sabbatical. Irene and I have worked together on various programs. She was my savior when I got moved over to the Director of Division of Water Resources. I will say that Irene I consider to be a consummate professional who was unbelievably talented in getting this very difficult program that we now call LSRP program into existence. I consider Irene to be, like I said, a consummate professional and a very dear friend of mine and a not bad golfing buddy as well. So Irene, I want to have profuse thanks for you being willing to do this. So Irene, let's get into it. Tell us quickly a little bit about your educational background.
Educational background was actually a biology degree and then a master's at Villanova in water resources. But that's not where you get educated going to school. Where you get educated is working, and that's for sure. So when I started at the DEP, I started in the water supply program. The interesting thing was people think that I started in site remediation in the assistant commissioner job, but my very first job at the DEP, I was working in contaminated well fields. When people's houses were impacted, private wells were impacted because of contamination from the site, the water division got involved and we had to come up with alternative sources of water for people, whether it was drilling new wells, treatment systems, or expansion of water supply systems. So that's how I really got started in site remediation back in the old water days.
So was DEP your first job out of school?
DEP was my first full-time job. I did do some consulting job for a small firm while I was going to get my master's, but afterwards it was the DEP. So I started in '83 and I worked there for 30 years.
How did you come to find DEP?
Family, family and friends. Obviously, my brother worked there, and a couple of people I met at Villanova worked at the New Jersey DEP.
So you held an incredible amount of different positions. Probably your best was working at Water Resources with me. But having said that, you work with some very talented people. George McCann it comes to mind. John Zapor, et cetera, et cetera. Tell us the evolution of up the ladder DEP. I know, and without going necessarily granular for every position that you had, but you had probably more experience across the board at DEP than any person I know.
Other than Wolf Skasel?
That was gratuitous, Wolf. Don't take that seriously.
So pretty much when I was working at the DEP, I never held a job for more than 4 years. I changed positions on a regular basis. So starting with Water Resources in the Water Supply Division, I moved on to work for the Director of Water Resources, George McCann at the time, as a hazardous waste coordinator, working with the 2 hazardous waste divisions, as well as being his executive assistant. That was my first introduction to working with the legislature as well. Always an eye-opening experience, and something that I always give a public service announcement about to anyone who lives in the state of New Jersey. One of the benefits of being in New Jersey is it's so easy to get to the legislature, to watch your legislators at work. We all know how interesting it is to see who's in the room, who's participating, who's falling asleep, and who doesn't really want to be there. So that was my first introduction to working with the legislators. And from there, I became the Bureau Chief of Groundwater Pollution Abatement. That was in the Division of Water Resources at the time. I was overseeing the geologists, hydrogeologists that managed all the cases within the department, from SRRA to RCRA to Superfund. So it was a technical position. It's currently under Barry. While we were in that division in Water Resources, we got moved, the first of many moves. The department obviously changes every time there's a new governor and commissioner come in. There's a lot of shifting of things happening. So we shifted to a Site Remediation Department. From there, I moved on to enforcement, working with Marlon Dooley and dealing with ocean cleanups and a whole bunch of other stuff. The CHOP program, which also County Environmental Health Act for folks who don't know it, where the department delegates to the county agencies. That had a component that was air and site remediation and solid waste. And from there, I don't even remember. No, I went to.
By the way,
actually,
she started when she was 12. So
yeah, actually, the most interesting of all the jobs, believe it or not, was when I went to work on the NGEMS program. So when I was working for Marlon, and for folks out there who don't know what we went through in the department, in the old days, every single program had their own individual little databases that tracked what they were doing. And a major initiative under Governor Whitman, and Wendy Rayner was her point person at the governor's office, and under Commissioner Shin, was trying to get one comprehensive database for the department so we could track things comprehensively across the board. And it's important to realize that impact that had on us later with the LSRP program, because we actually went to other states to see how other states were handling their data, their integration amongst programs. So that was really a challenging point in my career, especially with the air program. George, you were in charge of the air program at one point in time. So you knew that the minor permitting group and the major permitting group and the emissions permitting group would all look at that same stack and call it something different on the same piece of property owned by the same company. So one of the challenges was trying to get, starting with air, a comprehensive program, believe it or not, that just dealt with everything at a facility under the air program. And then we moved on to enforcement, which Wolf is now, was the beneficiary of dealing with how do you handle enforcement from a holistic standpoint. So that was a really challenging, interesting part of my career and taught me a lot about every part of the DEP.
Yeah, for sure.
From there, I moved on to management and budget, which was also eye-opening because budget is really interesting. What we do with the budget, how we play with the budget, how we move the budget, not having money was key to, again, what we decided to do in the LSRP program. You saw that every single year money was moved, money was diminishing.
Yeah.
More
Remember,
and more
I remember this is being recorded.
Yes, I know. The department has many mandates and many facets that most people on the outside do not understand and aren't aware of. We regulate more at the New Jersey DEP than probably any other state agency nationally, because we have a large component of what in other states would be in a health department, or in other states would be in a conservation and parks department. All of that is within the DEP. So dealing with the budgetary aspects and the different priorities that pop up across programs was a challenge. And again, something that influenced us as we moved forward with the LSRP program.
Yeah.
So after management and budget, I moved on when Lisa Jackson became commissioner to work in site remediation program, started working on the Site Remediation Reform Act. And after it was up and running and passed and the rules were out, the interim rules were out, I moved on under Governor Christie and Bob Martin to become deputy commissioner and try to implement change and transformation across the department as we did in the site remediation program.
Yeah, I think this gives everybody a background, a very detailed background, somewhat detailed background, as to why I think you were able to be successful in implementing a program that was a huge sea change, because of your knowledge, your breadth and depth of knowledge of the whole process. And quite frankly, I'm fond of saying the reason that sometimes I dislike you is because you did something that I could never do. And I admire you for your effort. One of the things I say, and I don't know how true this is, I wonder if you share this opinion. I thought one of the strengths of the programs when I was there, we had very strong technical people running the various programs. And I talk about John Trella, I talk about Don Dieso, I talk about George McCann and John Zapor, all good people who technically understood the issues aside from the regulatory issues, and therefore they could push back on their staff in terms of technically what was the mission. So do you, and I see that as being somewhat of a change. Do you believe I'm right or wrong?
I always think you're right, George. I think that if you look at the environmental programs across the nation, how things began in its infancy, a lot of the people that created the programs, started the programs, whether it was water or air or cleanup, were technical individuals that really understood science and were key to developing programs that were effective. And they understood as well the protection aspects of the environment, as well as the need for economic growth and redevelopment, and how to incorporate industry, regulated community, environmentalists, and the general public into the protection of the environment. I think that the staff in the DEP in New Jersey don't get the credit that they deserve because they are so highly technical. They do have a very broad perspective of what needs to get done and how to do it best. The problem is, unfortunately, governors and commissioners come and go on a very regular basis. And a lot of ideas don't filter up from staff through the chain of command to the areas that need to be, to the people that need to hear it. And every commissioner, I think, comes in with the idea that the staff within the department are not highly effective and are labeled, you know, as such. Until that first big problem hits, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's something nuclear, whether it's something like lead in drinking water or a kiddie college, and they realize that the people that they're relying on are so dedicated and will work 24/7 to make the right choices, the right decisions, and get things done. So tying that back to LSRP, you know, one of the things that we did in the site remediation program when I was assistant commissioner, I didn't come in and assume that I knew what was broken and how to fix it. I interviewed every single manager in the program and asked them what their 3 highlights were of the program, what they thought we were doing really, really well, and what their 3 biggest complaints were, what was keeping them up at night that they wish they could fix. And that was the beginning of how we started the reforms in the site remediation program. It was not with the legislature, and it was not with outside influences. It was internal to the department.
Yeah, I will say, as a modification of my statement, I thought that at the commissioner level, it was very important to have somebody who was not necessarily a technical person, but really more of a political animal, who really knew what the political issues were in order to implement the technical fixes. So I wanted to say that. Okay, so Irene, let's go into the SRP program. When did you start realizing that the SRP program required some fix?
Again, it started with interviewing the managers, listening to the things that they, you know, I had been out of the program for quite some time. So listening to them, finding out what kept them up at night, what their biggest issues were. And then on top of that, there's always that, you know, burning platform that you have to face. In our case, it was, we were dealing with the Pompton Lakes contamination site. We were dealing with a lot of sites that had things like Hudson Chrome, the Hudson Chrome sites that were very highly visible. We had munitions on certain sites. And then the clincher was Kitty College. And again, I want to remember to myself that not everybody knows what we're talking about when we say Kitty College, but you know, Acutherm was a thermometer factory down in South Jersey, not far from where I'm sitting right now.
Don't drink the water.
That was cleaned up and was done correctly, fenced off, no longer in use, rendered unusable for all intents and purposes, got lost in the databases and the system. the municipality and the county sold it, and it was turned into a daycare facility. So we had a site that was never supposed to be used and should eventually have been torn down, being converted to daycare. And we discovered that there was mercury in the building and children were exposed to mercury. Mercury was in their bloodstream. It was taken into their homes when they brought their teddy bears back home, et cetera. And it was really a health emergency, and it was a political nightmare. And that was the start of needing to really take the time to say, what are the biggest problems in the site remediation program? And they were the number of cases we had and the lack of people that we had. And some of the processes were not working. And now how do we fix that? And how do we get buy-in to fix it?
Right. So take me behind the scenes of the first meeting. Was Lisa Jackson commissioner at that point?
Lisa Jackson was commissioner, yes.
When Kitty College broke?
Yes.
Take me behind the scenes of that first critical meeting where she summoned, I presume, the staff and said, what the hell's going on here? I mean, was it acrimonious? What, just take us to a little bit, give us a flavor of what the meeting was like.
I actually came in shortly after that, so I would say that we had staff already on it when I became assistant commissioner. But I think that the issue was more, how could this possibly happen? What went wrong? Right. I don't think there was blame. There were, people weren't completely panicked at the time because we didn't realize that we hadn't done the testing for the mercury in the children. So it was, how did this happen? Yeah. And how can we fix it? Right. And Lisa and I were the first to testify together at the legislature. You're always called to the legislature the first time. You don't get to ask to be there. So we went down, and it was a very interesting legislative session, highly attended. Lots of emotion. But from there, we committed to making changes, to doing an evaluation and making changes to address the issues.
Well, so where did that thought come from? Who originally said, you know what, we got to shake the rug, get the dust out and start all over again? Who was the person who was primarily moving for that?
I would say that it was me. Yeah, I would say that I was somewhat panicked, and I was truly losing sleep at night, thinking of the number of cases that we had we had 21,000 cases at that time. And I think we had like 250 staff. So a lot of those staff were not even case managers. And every time, I was presented with a new case, there was some pressing need, whether it was an environmental issue, a health issue, or a redevelopment issue. So you're getting pressure from all different sides, and change is required. And the start of the program, again, was not necessarily with outside stakeholders. We started a process internal to the site remediation program. We met on a regular basis with all the different programs, the staff, on a quarterly basis with the staff, and came up with a list of recommendations for change. So it was from the bottom up that these recommendations came to us. And we had over 100 recommendations of things that the program itself wanted to address. Obviously, we had to cull that down. And I remember the first meetings that we had with Senator Smith was, okay, we have these 100 ideas, but we realized that the number one thing was budget and staffing, and doing an evaluation again of other states and what other states were doing, just like we did with the database situation and the IT issues. We came up with looking at Massachusetts as a potential model for how to use the existing consultant community to bolster what we were doing within the department. So Lisa and I flew up to Boston and met with, for a day or two, the staff and the different programs at the Massachusetts DEP to understand what they did, what was working, and what wasn't working.
So how difficult was it? Lisa came from EPA.
Yes.
And by the way, we know how much EPA loves this program, at least Region 2 loves this program, they abhor it. How difficult was it to convince Lisa that this sea change needed to happen? You can say difficult or not difficult. I'll let you pick.
I would say difficult. I would say that Lisa wanted change, did not think that the LSRP program would ever get off the ground. We both thought a lot of what they were doing in Massachusetts was great. But again, remember, New Jersey had a bunch of different laws in existence, most notably the Spill Act,
Right.
which really makes a difference. Other states don't have that. So we were unsure as to whether or not we could make it happen. I will say she very diplomatically said, "You got this."
You're wearing the stripes and you're going to
You got this. Good luck. See you later.
Yeah.
And so did a lot of other people. I mean, the professional engineers, the professional geologists all said, "You're crazy. It's never going to happen." EPA did not like it, as you noted. The enviros, obviously, the environmental community did not like it.
What about DEP staff?
Well, that was a challenge as well, of course. You have to, from a managerial perspective, again, make sure people understand that we were truly on the burning platform. And the status quo was not an option.
Right.
We could not be beaten up every day for trying our hardest and not getting things done. We had to make a change. And just like with the NGEMS, the IT program, you have to find those staff who are open-minded, are early adopters, and are willing to step out of the box and look at things differently and participate in what they believe could be a great change.
Right. So let me go back to the fact that you looked at Massachusetts. Massachusetts had a program since 1993. Damn successful, quite frankly. But they had a board. And when we first saw the draft from DEP, there was no board. What was the thought there?
Well, the thought was that it was just going to be another layer that was unnecessary. That even though PEs had a board, there's medical boards, et cetera, we thought that it wasn't required at that particular point in time, that the department could do the oversight of the LSRPs.
So some noted individual used to testify that if in fact there was not a board, that DEP was judge, jury, and executioner, and he would not practice in the state of New Jersey. At any rate, how did that position change then? That there was no board versus having a board?
I think a lot of it had to do with testimony that was provided by people who were in Massachusetts. We had folks from Massachusetts come down to testify. We also had people who, like Stu Abrams, who was instrumental in convincing the legislature that, as an outsider, he was very instrumental in convincing the legislature that
Yeah.
this was the way to go, that there needed to be, he actually was the one that convinced them that if someone's license was on the line, that they would take this very seriously, that it wouldn't be the fox watching the hen house, which was, the term the environmental community loved
Right.
to throw up there.
Right.
So it was the fact that there would be true consequences, not by the DEP, but by this individual board, that would impact an individual's livelihood, that convinced the legislature that this was something that was doable.
Well, what about you? I mean, DEP, did Stu convince the DEP that this was doable?
When you say this being the board or
The board,
program?
having the board.
Yeah, yes. However, I would have to say, who knew it would be so difficult to get board members? I mean, it's unpaid job. You're up there doing a lot of work on your own dime. Getting senators, assembly people to agree to nominate folks has been difficult. I don't even know do you have a full board at this particular point in time?
Not even close.
That is one of the things that is problematic. It truly is still a problem. It was a problem then, getting people to fill the board, and it's a problem that's ongoing.
Yeah.
A necessary role, but what do you do when it's a voluntary thing?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you that if I might be editorial here, I will tell you that it is a lot of work. And if you're not committed to putting in the time, and don't forget, many environmental professionals have is the ability to bill their time. And this will compete against the time that they have to bill. It's significant. If you really want to do the job, the work is significant. Now, I would defer to Phil as well. I bet that I put about at least 6 to 8 hours a week into this program. Yesterday, we had a 3.5-hour meeting. Today, we're going to have another 3.5-hour meeting. That's 2 days and 7 hours. So you're absolutely right. So I think some people can stumble into the board and not realize what the commitment is, and that bothers me, because if you're not willing to play and do your role, you're the missing link, and we need everybody pulling in the same direction. Okay, good. So then, Phil, you want to say anything?
No,
Nope.
You're all good, George.
Okay, thank you, Phil. So your relationship with Senator Smith and the legislature really enabled this thing to work and get passed, Irene. And you are the person who willed this program into existence, whether you like it or not. And for that, quite frankly, I think the citizens of the state of New Jersey should thank you. But talk to us about the importance of being able to work constructively with the legislature.
I can't say enough nice things about Senator Smith, because he really listened to us. In his role over the many years that he's been a legislator, he understands the issues, he gets the issues, he knows all the players, what they like, what they don't like, what's important, what's not important. So working with him was pretty phenomenal. And I will say the same for Assemblyman McKeon. It was Senator Smith who basically said, let's have a stakeholder process. And that was key. Getting the stakeholder process together, making sure that we had representatives from the environmental community, municipalities, the regulated communities, the attorneys who represented the regulated community, as well as the environmental community. Getting everybody to the table and having the discussions for as long as we did, all the months that we did. It was a long time coming. It was about a year in the making. That he was great. He was fantastic, and staying on us, making sure that we met regularly, participating in the sessions, holding hearings and interim hearings and joint hearings so that the legislature and the assembly were both in the room at the same time hearing what was going on was really critical. I think it's important to know, early on, the environmental community refused to participate. So I met with them individually and separately, but we had to keep them in the loop. At one point that they did agree. They agreed and they started showing up on a regular basis. And that was, really good. And I think it's important to know that the program wasn't just about creating LSRPs. It really was about strengthening the existing protections, and more importantly, getting people in the door, not voluntarily, but that mandatory obligation, that affirmative obligation to clean up a contaminated site was really life-changing.
Yeah.
The fact that people could come in and maybe sign an MOA or a voluntary agreement. So it was about strengthening protections. It was about expediting cleanups. It was about supporting redevelopment and making sure that properties weren't left unusable. It was also making sure, and I'm looking at Mike sitting down there. We always heard that we want a predictable but consistent process. And so trying to come up with something that was transparent, predictable, and consistent was a key goal. So on one hand, we were doing things for the regulated community. On the other hand, we were doing things for the general public from an environmental perspective. And how we meshed those was the discussions that were key to the stakeholder process.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to be a participant in the steering committee and the stakeholder group. And I will tell you that a lot of good people spent a lot of time, and you listened and you were objective. And that was rewarding. If that were not the case, a lot of those people would have said sayonara. But we knew that we were able to make an impact because you were listening to us. And that was paramount in terms of the commitment as well as the end product. I will say the following, however. This program was unique in that it allowed the LSRP to make decisions independent, theoretically, using their independent professional judgment without getting DEP's consent, except obviously in variances and so forth and so on, right throughout the whole process. But the remedial action permit has become somewhat of an albatross. And I believe, I'm fond of saying that the remedial action permit was your idea to keep track of engineering controls and biennial certifications, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's my recollection. However, this is DEP's opportunity to claw back because it is their permit, and therefore they believe that they have the opportunity to review everything that led up to the application of that permit. And therefore it gives them an opportunity to review and perhaps mandate change before you get a permit. Am I wrong in characterizing why you thought that remedial action permits were appropriate?
Let me go back in time and say, when I was assistant commissioner, it became very apparent to me that two things. Number one, the term no further action letter, for the general public and for a lot of the less savvy environmental crowd, they really truly believed it meant no further action. Even though most NFAs had conditions associated with them, such as biennial certifications, ongoing maintenance, monitoring, etc., some financial funding, securities. The people really, I got my NFA, I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm completely done.
Yeah.
So we did a internal evaluation of compliance with biannual certifications and inspections. And remember, at that particular point in time, I think the Brownfields Act required the DEP to inspect every engineering control on every 5-year basis.
Every 5 years.
And we had that one gentleman who was the cap cop, who calls him, and one person could not handle tens of thousands of cases to go out and make sure things were happening. So our compliance rate was, just absolutely abysmal. There was like a 93% non-compliance with biennial certifications.
Mhm.
So we had to do something different. That was really a big issue. And we decided that having a permit that was associated with the property and stayed with the property and stayed with the owner, operator, and subsequent owners and operators was the key. And I definitely stand by that. That was absolutely necessary and needed to happen. The remedial action permitting process was clearly one of the rough spots in the very beginning of the program, which is why we focused a lot on that with regards to trying to let people know that you're not really submitting what you're supposed to be submitting. We had to do a lot of kicking things back in the very beginning. And when I last left things, we were putting out technical guidance documents and working more closely with the regulated community and the LSRPs to develop, to improve the process. And let me just take one sidebar note and just huge shout out to the LSRP Association for forming, for, doing all the training that it does, for making sure people know what's going on, getting the forums together where people can talk about the issues and bring them to the DEP, for participating in all the technical guidance documents. I was going back and looking at some of the presentations I did way back in 09 and 10. And we had hundreds of people working on technical guidance documents in the very beginning of the process.
Yep.
So are there going to be bumps along the way? Absolutely. We knew that. We knew it then. There's still some now. So I'm told. I do some work on the outside, so I'm told.
Well, I will tell you, in my opinion, and it's only my opinion, it's not a bump, it's a pothole that'll swallow a Volkswagen. Because the way the process is working right now, in my opinion, that a permit reviewer gets a case that he or she knows nothing about, has no prior record in seeing any of the submissions. And then this component review that goes out to various people who also do not know anything about the case. And then what we have to do is spin the wheels and recreate everything that we've done in order to convince these people that it's an appropriate permit. It's not pretty. It's not pretty and it needs some change. And I know Mark realizes that as well. So that's my editorial comment. We're approaching 8:43. Give me 2 more minutes. And then what we can do is if you have a question, put it in the chat and Phil will talk to you about opening up, answering the questions and so forth. But so Irene, do you think that your programs are, and by the way, I consider this your program, and congratulations.
No.
And congratulations, absolutely congratulations. I think you were probably uniquely suited to bring this program into existence, as I said previously. So what do you think? What when you begat this program, are you proud of it?
Well, I absolutely am proud of it. You know, and not for me, but for everybody that has participated. It was tough handing it off. I will be honest. You know, Bob Martin asked me to be deputy commissioner and try and do some of the same things across all of the DEP. And so I moved on. But I think that both Dave Sweeney and Mark Peterson participated in the development of the program. Mark in particular when he was in enforcement, and you know, they've taken it and they've run with it, and they faced their own challenges, you know, from having to extend the mandatory deadlines early on. I would have to say that one thing that still kind of bothers me, and it's not related to the DEP at all, is the fact that we set this program up to make things happen quickly. And between some extensions early on in 2.0 or whatever it was, and then also COVID, we keep pushing those deadlines back, those regulatory and mandatory deadlines back. I would, you know, be remiss if I left out the fact that I wish we had completed a lot more by now. But I think that the challenges that pop up are just so unforeseen. And any program needs to be tweaked on a regular basis. I think the right people are doing it. I think the DEP are dedicated. I think the LSRP Association is dedicated to making sure that it happens. So I'm happy with where it's going. I wish I got to stick around a little bit longer, but so be it.
With that, we're about what, 8:48. Phil, if you want to start screening some questions and communicating them to us.
Yeah, so I will say right now, I don't have anything up there currently, but if anybody does want to raise their hand, I can also let you ask the question or put it in there. So a question did just come up. How did your now they're going fast and furious. How did your vision guidance documents, how did you vision guidance documents will be implemented and used by DEP? Currently, I think the DEP staff is using them as part of regulations.
Ooh. My vision was that they would not be regulations. You know, one of the things that was a key part of the discussions that we had early on in the stakeholder process was professional judgment. Everybody remembers that term in those debates. We wanted to have technical guidance document developed by a broader community, not just the DEP, which is why we had stakeholder groups working on the technical guidance. LSRPs should be allowed to use professional judgment. We retained the ability for the department to, you know, make decisions when an RAO could be invalidated, or if there was IEC conditions, et cetera, kind of take charge. But for all intents and purposes, technical guidance documents, in my vision early on, where it's just that technical guidance, give everybody something to start with so they know where they need to go, but not to be used as regulation.
So let me comment on that, if I may. The law allows for independent professional judgment, which means that you may deviate from guidance if in fact you are able to justify that your process is different from guidance, but it gets you to the same endpoint. That was the purpose of guidance. You wanted to know where the goal line was. And I was an advocate for guidance, quite frankly. And what we do as a board member, we see a lot. Well, contamination is coming from off-site, in my independent professional judgment. So therefore, this doesn't apply. No, that's not sufficient. Give us the reason why you believe contamination is not coming from off-site, and so forth and so on. If you're deviating from guidance or you're giving yourself a variance, you've got to justify it. And that should not be a big lift. In fact, you believe in it.
And so many experienced DP staff have left. The new people do not have the experience, in some cases, not even the level of education to understand the very old, very complicated cases that have finally reached the permit stage. And so they deny the permit. Instead, replace the LSRP's decisions with what they think should have happened or done. So there's no real question there, but I guess the question to you, Irene, would be is, where you were then and looking where we are today, what was really the thought process, or what would have been anticipated? People were going to retire. It was going to happen, and new people coming in. I mean, how is that institutional knowledge supposed to be filtered down so that, permit writers don't become case managers?
Well, that's a really good question. I think two things need to be said. Number one, the game plan was to anticipate staffing decreases over time and to not assume that you were going to get new staff. So my original goal was to rely more and more on the LSRP community and not even anticipate the need for a lot of new staff. That being said, you do have turnover and staff have to come in. It's where they start in the program. We talked about that a lot in every program in the department. Where do you start new staff? How do you start new staff? How do you give them the basic training just so that they understand the overall technical side of the department, the regulations? But more importantly, they need to know what the goal is and what their role is versus the LSRP's role is. So management has to take charge of that, from the supervisors to the section chiefs to the bureau chiefs. They're the ones that really have to set the standards for staff in terms of what to do and what to keep your hands out of.
So I will say that I think many of us have had this phrase sent, well, my professional judgment doesn't agree with your professional judgment. DEP saying that. Well, and when that was said to me, I said, that's fine. But my professional judgment has standing, yours doesn't. The only way you can reverse my professional judgment is you prove that my solution is not protective of public health, safety, and the environment. And if in fact you want to do that, go ahead. And by the way, I have to certify that my solution is a function of my independent professional judgment. So if I accept yours, I'm lying if I certify it. So there needs to be a better understanding, I think, amongst the department as to where the schism is. Next question, Phil.
Actually, a very interesting question from Mr. Toff. Now that
who's that guy?
Yeah, some guy in the audience. Now that there is an affirmative obligation to remediate, is SRRA still necessary? Connecticut just repealed its transfer statute, leaving New Jersey as the only state with such a program.
Ooh.
Yeah, and I will have to say, Mr. Toss asked me that question a couple of years ago as well.
He's got to get a new gig.
It's a great question because for all intents and purposes, I would say no. I mean, a lot of what it is, stock transfers, and it's such a messy program. I think when it first started, the intent was good, just
Mhm.
like anything else.
Mhm.
It was a way to bring cases into the department. And, we still, and Dennis included, are constantly dealing with the legal battles between companies, owners and subsequent owners over ISRA and what triggered ISRA. And, do you have to do a whole site cleanup versus can you do AOCs and all that, jazz that's associated with it. We tried to touch on ISRA somewhat when we did the Site Remediation Reform Act with regards to remediation agreements and remediation certifications. But it's something that is going to require somebody to take a really hard look at it and sit down with the legislature and say, you want to take this off the books, and taking something off the books is difficult.
Yeah.
Michael, you can unmute yourself.
Yep. Just to kind of follow up with that, Irene, and George and Dennis knows this as well as Wolf. The cycle of site remediation, we seem to go back every 10 years to fix something that, needs fixing, from ECRO to ISRA to brownfields to LSRP. So knowing that, Irene, what do we still, from your experience, what was left on the table? What do we still have to tinker with when we hit that next cycle? Probably be, new legislative folks on these various committees. And obviously the key is to educate and inform them of the history of site remediation. But sneak preview wise, what would you say one or two items that didn't get addressed in those iterations that you would like to see next go around?
I think Dennis touched on it. I think ISRA is a big one. And I know one of George's pet peeves, due diligence, is a big one. There still has to be that ability for somebody to look at a property, decide if they want to take that property, assume the risk. There's so much risk. Assume the risk and clean up the property. So that whole area that gets muddled up with contract law is something that really would be interesting to tackle. And then I think the other thing still, and we haven't touched on it very much here today, is the whole NRD issue. I mean, you all remember when Brad was here, he really linked, Brad Campbell, he linked as commissioner the NRD to NFAs. You couldn't get your NFA unless you settled NRD. We had the huge issue of the statute of limitations on NRD that was we were tackling, as well as Site Remediation Reform Act. So somehow better coordinating the NRD program with the cleanup program without hampering the ability to redevelop a site. And also, some of these NRD cases are just, wow. From the Passaic River to the Hudson River to the Delaware River. I mean, these are huge issues that need a much more comprehensive evaluation, rather than, picking 5 or 6 people and getting them in the room and saying, you're responsible for cleaning up this river. I mean, we all know decades of contamination that has caused the problems, not just from contaminated sites, but from permitted discharges and unpermitted discharges and stormwater. And then I think the last thing I would say is the whole green infrastructure issue. Would be nice to somehow look at. We tried it, we touched on it, it's soft, but how do you incorporate green infrastructure and sustainability into all environmental programs, but site remediation as well?
So I have one last question. We're running short. It's almost 9 o'clock. And I will tell you, I don't remember the answer the other day when we kind of prepped for this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So hopefully if you can say no comment, the intent back in the room, back in those early days of Sarah, when you were her mother, was an LSRP ever going to take their hat off?
Oh, Phil, come on.
I figured that would be my closing question. I couldn't remember how we left it the other day, but it's a topic that's come up a lot, and you can just tell me to shut up and then we can move on.
No,
Irene,
no. Hey,
Irene,
I was
Irene,
the one.
take the fifth, Irene, take the fifth.
I was the one that stood up there every time and say, no taking the hat off, but over time, the discussions that we had that dealt with PASIs and due diligence and, convinced me that there was times when you didn't have to quote unquote wear the hat. And then, but people got outlandish. It was like, well, if I'm walking past a site and I see somebody tip a drum and I don't really know what's in it, do I have to report?
Right.
I mean, it got a little silly.
Right.
But I think that, again, with anything, if you get down to the real issue is if you see something that's seriously a problem, you just as a citizen, just as a person, you should deal with it.
Yeah.
But if you're being paid to look at a site just for a separate company, you're not working for the owner or the operator, and you're just looking at it, should I buy this? Should I convince my client to buy it? And it's, historic fill. Do you have to report that? I would say that's kind of goofy. If you do a probe in the ground or dig a trench and you come across tons of DNAPL, I'd report it. So it's illogical. It's, using your brain and not just relying on the hat.
Gotcha. And before I let George close, I just want to make one statement. First of all, Irene, thank you very much for your time this morning and for all of you've done for all of us. I mean, we wouldn't have a profession in this state if it wasn't for you. And I have to say that, our days date back to 1987, 88. And so I was an intern from Cook College and you were running, I was the cube next door. Mary Ann Coleman, I think, was our secretary. If I remember her name, her daughter Kelly was there also.
Yes.
And I was scared crapless of you because I would watch you every day and I thought, oh, I got to stay out of her way. And years later, I may be still a little intimidated, but very happy to have, say that I think we're friends and we've come a long way since 87 and 88.
Yeah. Okay, hey, Phil, before I sign, Mr. Toft, if you're still on, please give me a call. I need to discuss something with you. But more importantly, that's business. I can build this. I can now build this. Irene, first of all, thank you so much. I've enjoyed my time working with you. You've always impressed me. You've saved my butt, particularly when I was testifying in front of the legislature on water issues. I hold you in the highest admirations position, as well as my affection for you. You're a wonderful human being, and I love what you've done for the state of New Jersey. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Everybody stay safe, be well, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Jules.